Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our September study session. Calling this meeting to order, and I will have our city clerk start with our roll call.
Mayor Kaylee Clark.
Here.
Deputy Mayor Karen Howe.
Here.
Councilmember Amy Lamb.
Here.
Councilmember Pamela Stewart.
Here.
Councilmember Kent Treen.
Present.
Councilmember Sid Gupta.
Here.
Councilmember Roshino Farrell.
Here.
Great, thank you. Councilmember Lamb, will you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance, please? Great, thank you. Councilmember Treen, do you have the land acknowledgement pulled up that you can read?
Yes. We acknowledge that we are on the indigenous land of the coastal Salish people who have reserved treaty rights to this land, specifically the Snoqualmie Indian tribe. We thank these caretakers of this land who have lived and continue to live here since time immemorial.
Great, thank you so much. I will entertain a motion to approve the agenda.
So moved.
Second.
All right. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Great. We will start with our proclamations. Deputy Mayor Howe, Emergency Preparedness Month.
So Emergency Preparedness Month, September 2024. Whereas National Emergency Preparedness Month, observed each September, is dedicated to promoting the importance of planning for emergencies and disasters to protect the lives and communities. And whereas emergencies can happen at any time, and being prepared helps minimize the impact on families and residents of Sammamish. And whereas this year's theme, Start a Conversation, encourages discussions about potential emergencies and the steps necessary to be ready to stay safe. And whereas engaging in conversations about preparedness helps Sammamish residents create emergency plans, assemble supply kits, and stay informed about potential risks. And whereas inclusive conversations ensure that all Sammamish residents, including those with disabilities and language barriers, understand their role in emergencies and are ready to act. And whereas the National Emergency Preparedness Month encourages everyone in Sammamish to take proactive steps to enhance their safety and resilience in the face of potential disasters. And whereas all residents of Sammamish are encouraged to participate in preparedness activities, such as making and practicing emergency plans, having 2 weeks of emergency supplies, and participating in training offered by the City of Sammamish. Now therefore be it resolved that Mayor Kaylee Clark, on behalf of the City Council, do hereby announce and proclaim September 2024 as Emergency Preparedness Month.
Great, thank you so much. Councilmember Stewart, will you please do National Recovery Month?
Certainly. National Recovery Month. Whereas National Recovery Month is an annual observance each September that promotes awareness of mental health and addiction recovery, celebrates the accomplishments of individuals in recovery, and acknowledges the support systems that assist them. And whereas the 2024 theme for National Recovery Month, The Art of Recovery, emphasizes the creative and diverse paths that individuals take on their journey to recovery, showcasing that recovery is a personal process that reflects the unique experiences and strengths of each person. And whereas recovery from mental health and substance use disorders is possible and achievable, fostering hope, resilience, and a renewed sense of purpose and belonging in individuals' lives. And whereas the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration outlines guiding principles of recovery, including a person-driven approach, the importance of cultural relevance, trauma-informed care, peer support, and focusing on individual strengths and responsibilities. And whereas increasing public awareness and understanding of mental health and addiction recovery helps reduce stigma, encourages individuals to seek help, and promotes the availability of evidence-based treatment and recovery support services. And whereas it is vital to recognize and honor the stories and contributions of those in recovery and their families, friends, and communities who support them, as these narratives inspire others and highlight the transformative power of recovery. Now, therefore, Mayor Kaylee Clark, on behalf of the Sammamish City Council, does hereby proclaim the month of September 2024 as National Recovery Month in Sammamish and calls upon all residents to observe this month by engaging in activities and events that support the theme, the art of recovery.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so our first presentation is with Vicki Carlson for the 2025 to 2030 Citywide Capital Improvement Plan.
Okay, so good evening, Vicki Carlson, Finance Director for the record. So as promised, tonight is the draft numbers. I'm going to be walking through the budget in 2 bites at this apple. So tonight is going to be the Capital Improvement Program, or the CIP. There are 7 funds that are included in the CIP. Of the 7, 2 of them, the Technology and Equipment Rental Fund, have a maintenance and operations element. We're only going to be talking about the CIP portions of those 2 funds tonight. We'll loop back on the maintenance and operations next week. The other 5 funds have only CIP-related costs, so you're going to see those funds in their entirety. This information that's presented tonight is kind of high-level summary information. You will be receiving the full GFOA budget and CIP documents on October 1st. That's going to be your line item budget, as well as the CIP sheets on every single project included in the CIP. I just want to walk in the front door with this. I know this is a lot of information that you're going to be given both tonight and next week. And since this is the first time that you're going to be seeing the numbers, please keep in mind that tonight and next week are information only. You're not being asked to make decisions tonight, right? So you're going to have multiple opportunities to review this information and ask questions. We're going to be creating a matrix of the questions and keeping it up to date as a reference for you during these next few months. And also, I'm always available to answer questions throughout this process. Don't hesitate to reach out to me. So again, tonight is part 1 of a 2-part presentation. Hopefully the pieces of this budget puzzle will start to fall into place once we've gone through both budget presentations. We did split it up into 2 because it can be overwhelming to try and get through all of this in one night. So you might remember this visual from last week. These are all of the funds that we have, and the boxes that are in red, those are the CIP funds, and those are the ones we're going to be coming tonight. So while these funds are, from an accounting perspective, they're standalone funds with budgets for each of the fund listed separately in the adopting ordinance. Many of these funds are connected together with each other via transfers of money, and I'm going to be referencing those connection points as we go through the materials. As we move through each fund, you're going to see 3 separate summaries for each fund. You'll see the full project list, the funding at a summary level, and the proposed budget for each of these funds. So the chart on this slide is the summary of the full 6-year CIP for the city. The projects in the CIP are ensuring that the facilities, parks, roads, and other city assets are maintained for today and into the future. We all know what happens when we don't do regular maintenance or fix things when they break, right? The same concept applies to our own assets. So we need to maintain them, which is part of the CIP. An example of that is the pavement preservation, which you'll see in the street fund. And we need to improve upon them for the future needs of our community going forward. So this is a planned investment of $159 million over the next 6 years. It's a comprehensive plan of proposed capital projects that support the continued growth and development of the city. And it's drafted to identify and balance the needs of the financial capabilities and limitations of our current revenue sources. So the left 2 columns in this chart, that's what's included in the biennial budget and represents an investment of $70 million over the next biennium. The proposed budgets from 2027 to 2030 are aspirational at this point because we don't have enough existing fund balance or projected revenues in the out years to fully fund this program. As we go through each fund individually, I'm going to call out where these revenue deficiencies exist, and you will see this next year when we cover the general fund, which is the transfers out into these different funds. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and jump into the first fund that we're going to be talking about tonight. So this first fund is the General Government Fund. This is the fund where we identify projects related to our own facilities. Projects that are included are the ones that exceed $20,000 and have either an extension or a preservation of the life of the structure. Over the course of the next 6 years, there's a planned investment of about $27 million, and about half of that in the upcoming biennium. So this fund has no dedicated funding sources, so all of the revenue in this fund comes from transfers from the general fund. If there's the determination that surface water benefits from the project, then surface water would also contribute that fair portion to the project. Two things that I want to point out about this particular fund. First, the transfers from the general fund are coming from existing fund balance, not from an ongoing revenue source, and I will show you this next week. We are using existing savings to pay for these projects. Second, the fleet electrification upgrade budget is a placeholder at this point. The cost we know about today is what's included in the budget. However, there are unknown costs associated with fleet electrification that have to do with the utility side of the project and those upgrades. That's not included in this budget right now because we don't know those costs. We have a study plan in 2025 to understand what those costs are, and we will be bringing that forward once we have that information. So this slide shows all of the projects included in the general governmental fund. The projects in green are related to sustainability. And you should note that the number of these projects cross years and in some cases cross bienniums. So for example, the fire station renovation, which is on the top line, that started in 2023 and right now has a planned completion date of 2026. We're doing design right now. So this is a project that is going to continue into the next biennium that was started this year. So decisions to stop that project have some consequences there. Also in the middle of the chart, you're going to see two projects, the MOC improvements and the MOC storage yard. This is an example of projects that start the next biennium and complete the further biennium, the next biennium out. So this is an example where decisions you're making today will affect decisions in the next biennium as well. So this next chart, this shows the funding for the full 6 years of the CIP. Note the transfers in from the general fund for all 6 years. And as mentioned earlier, we don't have existing fund balance or an ongoing revenue source to fully fund the projects for the full 6 years. And this is the budget for the general government fund. So the way this is laid out is the top section is the revenues for the fund. You can see there's a little interest earnings as well as the capital transfers. The capital transfers, again, are coming from the general fund. The next section is the expenditure section. This is the cost of the projects. That's the only thing that's included in this particular fund. The cost to administer the projects, like staff time and just the administration of the projects, that's captured in the general fund. So this is the project cost only. The bottom section of this chart is the fund balance section. I'm showing you the change in fund balance, which is revenues less expenditures, what the beginning fund balance is each year, as well as the ending fund balance each year. The left half of the chart are actuals. So we provided you with 2 years of historical data, as well as what we project to earn and spend for this year. And please keep in mind that the projections are as of a point in time. We drafted the projections as of what we knew at that point. So they will change as time moves on. We've also included the 2024 budget so you can compare the current year budget to what the current year expectations are. And then the far right two columns are the budget for the next biennium. So I'm showing you each year of the budget, even though we do adopt a biennial budget, which is combined, because each year then lines up to each year within the CIP. Again, total planned expenditures for this fund is $8.2 million in 2025 and $4.8 million in 2026. The other thing I want to point out on this fund is the ending fund balance over time. We ended 2022 with just over $6 million in this fund, but by the end of 2026, we expect less than $600,000. So we are drawing down this fund balance that has been sitting in the fund for the last couple of years. So before I move on to the next fund, I'll pause to see if you have any questions on the general government or facilities fund.
Deputy Mayor Howell.
Yeah, I had a quick question about, I noticed that HVAC is noted as being an environmental thing. Can you help me understand what it is that we're hoping to achieve with HVAC upgrades? Or do you not want to go to that level of detail?
So I can answer the numbers questions, but I'm going to turn to somebody else to answer the project-specific
And
questions,
the other
if that's
part
okay.
is if we're doing something for sustainability, is there any trade-off in terms of what we get back? Like if it's a cooler building, we're not spending as much on heat. You know, I'm just trying to understand if there's any trade-offs that we get, if that's captured anywhere.
There we go. Thank you, Deputy Mayor. That's one of the pieces that we're working on. We don't necessarily have those numbers directly in front of you, but in terms of reinvestment in buildings, anytime you upgrade or replace your HVAC, you're more fuel efficient, which is starting to get at both fuel efficiency, so reducing our power usage, and as council starts to, we start to implement the climate action plan, that then there will be considerations about what we replace it with. And those costs go up, but then the value goes up as well in terms of how it supports the environment. So we're continuing to work on those pieces. The pieces that are in front right now are upgrades that need to be made for failing systems or soon to fail systems. And that's really the part about the environmental piece at the moment.
Thank you.
Councilmember Stewart?
Yeah, I have a similar question. I think the fire station upgrade, while I know that there's a tiny, tiny part of that is about wiring it for solar panels, I wouldn't necessarily call the fire station renovation a sustainability project. It would be lovely if it was, but more importantly, I'm struggling with these numbers. So in 2024, the ending fund balance is 9 million. But we're saying that the beginning fund balance for 2025 is 4.8 million.
That is correct. So when the budget was drafted a couple of years ago, this budget was based on projections back then. The way this chart actually works is if you look at the projected column over here, the 4.8 million, this is what we're projecting to end 2024 as opposed to the budget. And so this projected end year end becomes the beginning fund balance for 2025. And I apologize, my cursor's being a little jerky. Otherwise, I would move it smoothly from the end of 2024 projected to the beginning fund balance of 2025. It is a little confusing showing the budget in there, but I wanted to be full transparency, right? So I wanted to include the budget so you can see the difference between how we budgeted that fund versus how we're projecting to end 2024.
Okay, great. Two more questions. One is, so this general government fund, is this separate from just the general fund, or is
Correct.
this is separate?
This is a capital project fund, so
Okay.
the only thing captured in here are project-related costs.
But the fund balance is not what we see in the general fund
No, this
today.
is specific to its own fund.
Excellent. That is awesome. And then I guess what I would love to see is if we budgeted to have 9 million and we're only going to have 4.8 million, I'd love to know what happened to that other 4.2 million.
It would be the spend down that occurred in 2023, where we did not transfer in additional revenues, so we started bleeding that fund balance down as opposed to just leaving it there and continuing to transfer money in from the general fund.
But clearly, that's not what we had planned to do. So I love it as we move into the budgeting for 25 and 26, just as a lesson learned, how did we miss budget by 4.2 million, right? Because obviously we wouldn't have had a budget ending fund balance of 9 million unless something came up or we did something different. And it was probably a decision we made, and that's okay, but it would just be great to know what that is. Thanks.
And it could have also been because we had delays in capital project costs, so we can definitely look into that and get an answer back to you.
Great, thank you.
Councilmember Lamb?
What is the flooring replacement for City Hall? What does that include?
I can answer that, Councilmember Lamb. The City Hall specific flooring replacement are the tiles out here just in the lobby that have a slightly annoying habit of all of a sudden popping up and having to replace. If council will notice, there's been carpet over a section of tile. That's not the only section that has popped up. And so we need to find out what's going on. We don't know yet, but we're going to bring on an architecture firm to assess what's happening and why they're popping up, because there are multiple tiles that are loose on the floor out here, and so we need to figure out what's going on and possibly, in all likelihood, replace the tile with something else or with new tile that will stay attached to the floor.
Okay, I guess, as we go through the budget, I think this is one thing perhaps we could probably push down the road.
And I appreciate that. This one is more of a safety hazard because, for instance, the last time it happened, we showed up on a Monday morning and the tiles were sticking up like a tent, 2 full rows of tiles. And so we have loose tiles. There's the opportunity for trip hazards and for people getting injured. And so that's why it's on the CIP as a priority project.
Okay.
All right, I don't see anything else. Thank you.
Okay,
Oh,
so-
sorry.
oh.
Deputy Mayor Howe.
I just have one question about Streets 101 for the budget in terms of the 1594 and 1595 and so forth extending out for a 6-year total of 10 million. I was interested as to how consistent that number was over time. And I was wondering how that was determined.
Sure, and if I could put a placeholder on that question, because we're actually going to cover that fund later on in the presentation, if that's okay? Okay.
All right, go ahead. Thank
Okay,
you.
so moving on to, oops, I'm going backwards here. So moving on to the Parks Fund. Where am I here? Okay, so the park system, as we know, is an integral part of the community. Parks are consistently shown to be a high priority on community surveys. There's a number of projects related to parks that are planned out over the next 6 years, totaling $49 million, with about $14 million planned for the upcoming biennium. There are some other budget points or bullet points on this slide, but I'm going to cover them as we go through the next couple of slides. So on this page, I know it's difficult to see, but this is the full list of planned parks projects over the next 6 years. And again, same as we saw in the general government, the left 2 columns is what is included in the budget. So a few items to note on this slide. So first, note line 4, which is the Big Rock South improvements. So this is a significant project that is projected to begin next year and completion not until 28. Same as the Parker Property Master Plan. That one's expected to begin in 2026 and completed in 2027, which is the following biennium. So again, just like the last fund projects, this is an example of when you commit to the projects in the next biennium, there's a carry forward into the future biennium. Also, I want to point out the town center land acquisition. This is to achieve the city's adopted vision for a town square within the town center. It's being paid for with a transfer from the general fund. As with the general government transfers from the general fund, this $5 million is also coming from existing fund balance, not from an ongoing revenue source. And the other project worth noting is the Klahani Park project. It's another significant investment that isn't expected to start until 2028. But this is just for awareness of a major investment that you will see in the future biennium coming forward. So this is the proposed funding for these projects for the next 6 years. There is currently dedicated revenue with REIT, impact fees, and the King County Parks Levy. I wanted you to note the transfer in on the general fund of $5 million in 2025, and then again, the proposed transfer out in 2030. We have funding for the 2025 transfer. We do not have currently fund balance for the 2030 fund balance. And then this is the budget for the Parks Fund. Again, the proposed budget for the next 2 years is on the right-hand side with historical data as well as the projected amounts for this year. So there's a few things to note with this particular fund. So first is the property tax levy. It does expire in 2025, but we have included a budget in 2026 as it is likely that the Parks levy will be renewed. If it's not, obviously we'll have to adjust. On the previous slide, there was a bullet point about the volatility in the housing market that affects our REIT revenue. And you can see this volatility here in the REIT data. For example, in 2022, REIT revenue was over $3.7 million, and the next year it was $1 million less. So when we worked through the projected year in this year, it looked like it was going to come in between those 2 years. So that's what the budget is, the projected year is based off of. Budget is based off of prior year averages because there's really no way to know what REIT is going to generate each year. I also want to point out interest earnings as a revenue source. So in 2022, total interest earnings was just shy of $400,000. However, when interest rates started to go up, interest earnings also shot up. The significant interest earnings in this fund is because of the high fund balance. When you invest $30 million, you do tend to see a pretty decent return, but it's not sustainable. So the feds have signaled that they do plan to start reducing interest rates. Plus, you can see we're also spending down fund balance. So with the significant projects that are planned for the out years and the lack of growth in the dedicated funding sources, without a new revenue source like an MPD, fund balance will decline to the point where transfers from the general fund will be necessary, but there won't be general fund money available. Again, we will cover that next week. Again, the only costs captured in this fund are the actual project cost. The administration of the project cost are in the general fund. Okay, before we move out of parks, any questions on this fund?
I don't know. Deputy Mayor, do you have?
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
So sorry.
I do. Oh, Councilmember Stewart.
Yeah, same question, Scott, as last time. It looks like we're projecting to spend 10 million more than we had originally budgeted. Would love to know what that delta is, just so we have that as sort of historical knowledge as we plan for the future. Thanks.
For 2027 REIT, is that that jump because of the lower interest rates? Or do you know something that's happening in 2027?
2027 REIT. Okay, so this is where CIP and budgeting gets a little complex.
Okay.
So what is on this slide here is how each project is funded, not necessarily how revenue comes into the fund. So on this top line, you'll notice it says REIT current and prior year. So this is an accumulation of REIT that we haven't spent in prior years that we're spending all in 2028.
Great, thank you. Anyone else for parks? Councilmember Gupta, he got it first.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, just really quickly. First of all, I appreciate the staff responses to the questions I sent ahead of time. That really helped. I just wanted to call out, I would love to see a line item for bike racks and parks. That is important to me. Hopefully it's not a huge spend, just something I'd like to see as we dive in deeper.
Councilmember Stewart?
Yeah, if we have an accumulation of REIT revenue in 2027, why are we drawing $5 million from the general fund in 2025?
That is specifically earmarked for the town center project.
And REIT can't pay for it?
It could. This is just how we've budgeted. There may be some other historical pieces with that particular project that I'm not aware of.
If I may, Councilmember Stewart, the answer to that question is the town center project is separate from the rest of the park CIP in some measure. And so you could use REIT to potentially fund that piece of it. However, it means that you're not able to do other things. And so we felt that it was important, given the priority of parks and parks projects, to keep the park CIP essentially whole, if you will, and that the town center Town Square potential purchase is one that would be a separate item overall. So it's not to say that you all couldn't change that, but that's what we're currently proposing to do.
And then I noticed on the budget that there's no planned expenditure for any additional land acquisition for parks other than the town center, Town Square.
That is correct. We don't have anything in the next 6 years. I am aware that money was given to the Parks Fund several years ago to purchase land acquisition. There is a balance remaining of about $4.3 million. It is not planned to be spent in the 6 years, so it is currently sitting in fund balance. In fact, you can actually see it. Actually, you can't see it on this because it's in the out years. We're holding about $4.3 million for future land purchases unless policy changes to revert that money to other projects.
Okay.
And if I may, Council, just to be clear, you could choose to use those dollars. However, since those were initially allocated to park purchase, I would posit that while the town square will be a fantastic resource for the city, it's not actually a park from that perspective. I think we would all agree that we would like for a different use for that. And so that's why there's a little bit of a distinction, recognizing that land acquisition fund was set aside specifically for park land acquisition. So that's a policy choice that you all could choose to address, but we have not addressed it in what we're proposing in the budget moving forward.
All right, I'm not seeing any other hands. Thank you.
Okay, so moving on to the Transportation Fund. So as you're aware, all cities are required to adopt a Transportation Improvement Plan or a TIP that covers the ensuing 6 years, and we have to update it annually. We most recently updated the TIP in June of this year, and the projects that are in the TIP are also the same projects that's in the CIP, so the project list should look familiar. Total planned expenditures for the next 6 years is $28 million, with half in the next 2 years. Based on the current plans, no transfers from the general fund are needed, but you'll see some volatility in this fund, the same that we saw in the Parks Fund. And finally, we do recognize that there are unfunded transportation-related community priorities. They're not included in the TIP or the CIP. We do have some 2025 work plan items that will look at multiple plans that will include development of additional CIP projects. Two things to keep in mind for when new projects are added to the CIP, and this actually goes for all CIP projects, not just for this fund, but we need to identify where the funding is coming from or where the reduction is coming from elsewhere. We can't just add something into a budget without figuring out how it's going to be funded. And we also need to identify the ongoing operating costs that come with additions or expansions of our assets, because those also accumulate and affect our operating budget. So those are two key pieces that, as we make changes to the CIP, really need to be part of the consideration going forward. So this is the list of projects in the next 6 years that are transportation related. And again, these projects match up to the adopted TIP. This is the funding for the projects. And again, most of the funding for these projects is coming from REIT. We do have impact fee revenue, but transportation impact fees are restricted for use on only specific projects. Right now, there's only 2 projects that qualify for use of impact fees, and that's the Sahalee Wade Northeast project and the 2 Issaquah Pine Lake Road projects. We are preparing to do an update to the impact fees, all of them, both parks and transportation, to see what other projects might qualify for use of the impact fees, and we're targeting to complete that next year. And again, this is the budget for the Transportation Fund. Similar revenues as the Park CIP fund, with the same volatility with REIT and the same decline in interest earnings. Note that we are drawing down ending fund balance in both 2025 and 2026. But at the end of 2026, there's still adequate fund balance for the future year projects at this point. One last thought on this fund. Again, when CIP projects are added to both the TIP and the CIP, we may very well need to identify additional funding sources, because at the end of this, we do start running out of our banked REIT and impact fees. And again, only costs captured in this fund are the actual project costs. And again, I'll pause if you have any questions on the Transportation Fund.
Councilmember Treen?
Yeah, because you just mentioned, so when would it run out?
I can get that answer for you. I don't have that in front of me. But there's 2 components that we have to monitor, right? We have 2 restricted revenue sources, REIT and impact fees, and we have to make sure that we're spending both of them appropriately. So it's possible we might run out of one, but not the other. But again, with impact fees, they can always be spent on certain projects, so we have to monitor how those funds are being spent. I can do a little deeper analysis and provide that to you later.
I appreciate that. Thanks.
Councilmember Stewart?
Yeah, appreciate that, like, in 2026, we've lowered the interest revenue because interest rates are likely to come down. But it's generally the REIT would go up, right? When interest rates are lower, you see a lot more turnover in the housing market. So I would expect to see a higher projected REIT revenue in years when the interest rates are lower.
Again, it's really difficult to project REIT, so we take an average of historical data. And if we spot trends, we can adjust the budget, but right now it's truly based on historical data. And with most of our land turnovers, most of it is housing, which doesn't generate a significant portion. We need a commercial property to turn over, an apartment complex or something where we're going to see significant rate, or something related to town center.
Right, I'm not seeing any other hands.
Okay, so now we're going to move on to the street fund. So as I mentioned last week, the street fund has been revamped a little bit. In prior years, the gas tax was recorded in this fund and then transferred to the general fund where the street-related projects were recorded. Beginning next year, the revenue is going to stay in this fund, and pavement preservation costs, as well as a few other traffic-related projects, will be captured here. Total spending over the next 6 years is planned to be $10 million, with about $4 million planned for the next biennium. And a couple of these bullet points I'll cover in the next couple slides. So this, because there's just a few short list of projects in this fund, you see both the project list on the top and how the projects are funded on the bottom half of this sheet. Funding comes primarily from the fuel tax, but a transfer from the general fund is required every year to fully fund all of these projects. As with any of the other CIP projects, transfers from the general fund are coming from existing fund balance, not from an ongoing revenue source. And this is the budget for the street fund. So there's a few things to note with this budget. So first is the state shared revenues. That is the gas tax. Note that this revenue source is not growing. You can see we budgeted $1.7 million in 2024, but we're actually projecting to bring in about $1.4 million. This is the tax that's paid at the pump when people gas up their cars. The tax is then distributed on a formula that the state keeps some of it, and the rest is distributed to counties and the cities. It's based on population, not the numbers and types of cars within the cities. We do expect this revenue source to start to decline as more people transition to electric vehicles. As consumer behavior changes, our revenue streams also change, right? Every time a car is filled up at the pump, a tax on the fuel is charged. But for Sammamish, because we don't currently have a utility tax, when those charges go electric, they start to run on an energy source that is not currently taxed. I just wanted to call that out. But for some of these same vehicles, though, that are now electric, they're still driving down our roads causing wear and tear. So just something to keep in mind. Other than the gas tax, there's no real revenue source into this fund. One other item that I want to point out on this fund is the beginning fund balance does start at 0 for 2025. It's because gas tax was put in this fund and immediately transferred out, so there was no existing fund balance. So this is pretty much starting from scratch, the beginning of 2025. The targeted fund balance is low, and this is a visible example of where we have not budgeted for what ifs or those unplanned, unknown costs. So if a project cost exceeds budget, or if an unanticipated issue emerges, then we will have to come back for a budget amendment. Or if there's planned project cost elsewhere that we need to reduce to cover any unexpected. So I wanted to point that out because it's a good example of how we have worked to strip out those unplanned, unfunded costs. And just like the previous three funds, the only costs captured in this fund are the actual project costs. And going back to the question on why is it $1.5 million each year, I'm actually going to lean on Audrey, who's online, to answer that question.
Good evening, Council. For the record, Audrey Starcy, Public Works Director. That was a great question. We do forecast our pavement preservation needs based on the condition assessment at the time. Our current pavement condition assessment is from 2021. We do have a planned assessment in 2024 that will include a 5 to 8 year outlook for all of our expenditures. So this was just based on costs. Keeping at a certain PCI from a few, or within a range of our pavement condition index or PCI from a few years ago.
I think where I was headed with this too is it just seemed unusual to have something that was straight across and that you wouldn't just have it automatically increase over time just to accommodate whatever inflation or just additional costs you might be anticipating. So that was my concern, is that if it's straight across like that for 6 years, are we actually decreasing what we're doing because there's going to be inflation over that 6 year period?
And this is something that we can that we will be looking into much further with our pavement condition assessment work in 24 to take a look at both what funding levels do we need to be at to achieve a citywide PCI that council helps us to determine, as well as prioritizing PCI or pavement improvements on our arterials and our collectors. So, well, lots of meetings to come in the future in 2024 about pavement preservation and restoration. And then I know the other piece of pavement preservation is actually street reconstruction, and that was highlighted in the 340 fund that Vicki just went over a little bit. So there's two components to pavement management in Sammamish.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Stewart?
Yeah, I know that the gas tax revenue is declining as more people, hopefully it's two things, people converting to electric vehicles and just plain driving less. But I also know that electric vehicles pay a really high fee when you register your vehicle. Do we as cities get any of that revenue from the vehicle registration? Because I actually pay more for vehicle registration than I would if I had a gas car and paid gas tax.
Not that I'm aware of.
Need to look into that. All right, cool, thank you.
Anyone else? Nothing while Audrey's still here? Okay.
Well, she'll be coming back, I promise. Okay, so these next two funds that we're going to talk about will be presented a little bit differently. Both the technology and the fleet fund have a maintenance and operations component. So we're only going to be looking at the capital component tonight. We'll be back next week to review the M&O element and bring the entire fund together so you see both pieces of it. For technology, significant investments are planned over the next 3 years with reduced needs in the final 3 years of the CIP. Total capital spending on tech is about $3 million for the 6 years, with about 2/3 of it in the first 3 years. Funding for technology for both the M&O as well as the capital come from both transfers from the general fund as well as the surface water funds. The split is between the two is by FTE count, and for the next biennium, capital transfers from the general fund is about $375,000 and about $55,000 from surface water. There is one additional funding source for this fund, and that's the technology fee. Given the current rate we charge, which is higher than most of our all of our surrounding cities, there's really no room to increase this fee. And on this slide, this is a list of technology and represents an investment in upgrading or replacing systems to create efficiencies or lowering costs, as well as data security. And this slide shows the funding. Again, funding comes from either the technology fee or transfers from other funds. Again, you'll see the budget next week when we go over both the M&O and see the capital piece blended in. So any questions on this fund?
Nothing.
Okay. So moving into the equipment rental. So again, same thing. This has an O&M component as well as capital. So we're just going to be talking about the capital piece. The capital portion is replacing the city's rolling stock and equipment on a regular schedule. Total replacement costs over the next 6 years is about $5 million, with $600,000 planned in the next 2 years. Funding for the equipment replacement will require roughly $1 million in transfers from the general fund over the next 2 years, as well as $154,000 coming in from surface water. And I also want to mention that with the adoption of the budget and the full list of vehicles scheduled for replacement in the next 2 years included both in the CIP and the budget document, that adopting the budget would give Scott authority to purchase the vehicles on this schedule as outlined in the CIP. This would be for vehicles purchased only in the 2025-2026 biennium, not in the out years. And here is a list of the vehicles that are planned to be purchased over the next 2 years. In the memo that's attached to the agenda bill is the complete list. It's very extensive. There's no way we could have fit this on a slide. So just showing the next 2 years' purchases. Any questions on equipment rental?
Yeah.
And I do want to mention, too, that we do plan to do a complete review of fleet next year to see what kind of an overhaul could be made.
Cool. Deputy Mayor Howe?
And I'm sorry, Vicki, I want to go back to the other presentation you just did about just the MIS stuff. Yeah, the financial system upgrade. So RFP, so is it in an RFP process right now?
Not yet. I'm actually currently drafting an RFP. So
Okay.
right now we have Springbrook as our system of record for accounting functions.
Right.
And it is a very old system that has not been built out. So we need to create efficiencies in our accounting processes, in our financial management processes, and our budgeting processes. And one of two things needs to happen, right? We either need to build out Springbrook, or we need a different ERP system, and we need to understand what the full capabilities of Springbrook are. And so what we're going to be doing is doing a full RFP, and we're hoping that Springbrook responds, as well as other vendors, and then we can do a side-by comparison. Obviously, the faster, cheaper way would be to build out Springbrook, but if Springbrook doesn't have the capabilities we need to see us move into the 21st century, then we've already done the RFP, we already have responses back, and we can move forward with a different vendor.
And oftentimes, if you're selling an enterprise system, the sales pitch will be, and you don't have to add staff because the system will accommodate it. I'm just curious if that's a component of the RFP that you're creating in terms of downtime for training, and just, is it going to be something that conserves staff?
We will be looking, we're taking our time through this process because we want to make the right decision. We want to make a decision that's going to last the city well into the future. I actually did this process the last few years of my last job. We actually just implemented an ERP system right before I transferred to come here. So I'm very familiar with this process. It's very time consuming up front, right? We need to do a full-on RFP, go module by module, outline exactly what our needs are today as well as into the future. Once we do demos, they need to be scripted demos, right? We need to be able to see, I don't want to hear from a vendor what they want to show us. We want them to show us what we need to see, right? What is actually going to serve our best purposes? So it's going to be a long road to get to that answer, whether it's building out Springbrook or replacing a full ERP system. I have been working on the RFP myself. It's almost drafted, and we hope to get it out in the next few weeks. Because next year being an off-budget year, next year is the year to tackle all of these projects, because what I want to do is I want to streamline our processes. I want to revamp this budget process so it's even better next budget cycle.
Very good, thank you.
Councilmember Stewart.
Yeah, what is the phone system replacement that takes 5 years and $145,000?
Yeah, thank you, Councilmember Stewart. So we are moving towards getting all of our staff on Teams phones, which means that we would transition out of desk phones, but it takes time to implement all of that and rotate everybody over. So the phone system.
You just have Teams, and everybody already has Teams, right?
It's unfortunately not as easy as that. That's my understanding from our IT director. And so we also have the current phone system that we have is no longer it won't be supported after a couple of years. And so this is partly we need a transition. And there's also some costs to support the software we need to support all the Teams phones. So it's a combination.
All right, I'll ask more of
Yeah.
Tim. Thanks.
Certainly.
Anything else?
All right, let me catch up here. So we have made it to the last fund of the night. This is the surface water CIP, and the projects are the same that was adopted in the SWIP back in June. It builds on the prior CIP and the surface water rate study. The CIP also reflects the enhanced level of service that was adopted previously. Total projects for the next 6 years total $38 million, with about 23 over the next biennium. Utility charges provide most of the funding for these projects, with about $2.5 million coming from grants. Again, the surface water CIP is based on prior approved level of service, and after we get through the budget for this fund, I am going to turn this back to Audrey so she can touch a little bit on the level of service. This is the list of projects for surface water. And this is how they are funded. Again, mostly through transfers from the SWIM fund. This is the utility rate charges that we have. And finally, this is the budget for the surface water capital fund. Note the grant revenue, excuse me, in 2025 and 2026, as well as the contributions and interest. But again, the majority comes from the surface water M&O fund as a transfer. We're also budgeting to spend down fund balance. We're going to be doing additional review on this particular fund balance in this fund next year, so we can work on right-sizing what this fund balance should be. And any questions, and before I turn it over to Audrey, again, I can talk about the numbers, but project-specific, it's probably going to be Audrey jumping in to answer those questions.
Councilmember Gupta.
Thank you. Could you help me understand the developer contribution section in revenue?
On this slide or this slide?
The second slide, the other slide.
This one?
Yes.
So we actually don't have developer contributions plugged into these projects. We do have a little bit of budgeted developer contributions, but they have not been applied specifically to projects at this point. It's very minimal coming in that we're projecting.
Thank you.
Okay, if there's no other questions, I'm going to turn it over to Audrey so she can talk about level of service.
Thank you, Vicki. Good evening again, Council. So just a reminder, one of the prior slides did go through our Stormwater Capital Improvement Plan, which of course was adopted earlier this year. That plan is based on enhanced level of service that Council set in 2022 for 2023 and 2024. That level of service includes all of our stormwater permit requirements. That permit did just end earlier in 2024. We have a new NPDES, or National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, stormwater permit that began, I believe, in August 1st of this year. That is a 5-year permit that does have additional requirements. So we will be looking at that, and I'll get into that in just a moment. In addition, our enhanced level of service currently includes goals and objectives and projects and programs from our 2016 Storm and Surface Water Management Comprehensive Plan. It also includes operations, and which we'll go into a little bit more next week, and a few capital projects and programs that were not included in other levels of service when we went through our level of service selection in 2022. The great news is some of our programs on our capital plan are forward-thinking and very proactive, and those programs can be utilized for some of our reporting requirements for our next stormwater permit. So it was great news there. Going into the next biennium, we do have a work plan, several work plan items related to the utility. So one is an update to our 2016 Storm and Surface Water Management Comprehensive Plan, as well as an updated rate study. So as you'll recall, several of these projects and programs are new, and we will be reviewing these programs along with new permit requirements when we look at our rates for 2027 and beyond. Currently, staff recommends proceeding with the enhanced level of service. That is something that Council sets per biennium, so we'll be back in October with a prepared motion for Council to consider for 25 and 26. I'm happy to take any questions about that, and if not, I can turn it back over to Vicki.
Councilmember Treen.
I just kind of want to follow up on Councilmember Gupta's question on the developer contribution. Is that zero because the expectation is that the developers are actually building the stormwater facilities? So there's kind of like, in accounting, there's a wash there, it's an in and out?
There's two different ways facilities are built, either through our citywide CIP or through private development, which often in Sammamish those assets are released to the cities after completion of a successful bond period. So those do become ours. With the development activities, those assets actually, in addition to being bonded for that period of time, the developers do pay our system development charges, or SDCs. We did review those with the last rate study, so there are some contributions, essentially fees for connecting to our utility.
So would we, on the budget, do we see that then in operations? So we'll see that on the next presentation?
I need to double check, but I believe it'll be in the operations.
Thank you.
Anyone else for this one? Okay, not seeing any hands.
Okay, so we made it through the CIP. And I do want to quickly thank Scott. I have to remind myself that I have only been here for 4 months, so I'm getting much more familiar with the numbers, but I still don't have a lot of the specifics on the projects, so I appreciate him jumping in and answering those questions on the projects. Next week, we're going to be covering maintenance and operations, which will include the general fund. That's going to be the big focus. Plus, we'll also capture the M&O side for surface water, as well as pick up the M&O for fleet and equipment, fleet and technology. After the 17th, we're going to be scheduling time for either individually or small groups to give you more time to ask questions and understand this information. Because again, I know this was a lot of information that I just kind of fed you tonight. And as noted with the funds, and you will see this next week, but the full CIP is aspirational at this point unless we identify additional revenue sources or reductions are made. 2025 work plans will identify additional projects that could be added to the CIP, but again, when something gets added to the budget, and actually this goes for the O&M piece as well, anytime the budget is increased, we need to identify where that funding source is coming from or where reductions are coming from. One final point, we have been doing some capital budget outreach. We did this throughout the summer. We conducted outreach to understand the community's capital budget priorities. We were at the farmers market multiple times. We also did an online survey. We are summarizing those details right now, and we'll be providing that on October 1st when you get the full budget document. And with that, this is just a reminder of the calendar for when you will see the rest of the budget laid out. And with that, I am happy to answer any other questions you may have.
Councilmember Stewart?
Yeah. Is there going to be a discussion of potentially bonding for any of these big capital projects? Because that is oftentimes a more efficient way to pay for these giant infrastructure projects that will be around for decades to come.
Yep, so I would say in order for us to bond, there's a few things that need to happen first. So whenever you bond, and I know the city hasn't done bonding for a long time, so happy to do a presentation on what it would take to actually provide bonding in the future. But in today's world, if you want to issue bonds, you have to identify the project that the bond is for. You also have to spend those bond proceeds within a certain time frame, or you have to repay any additional interest earnings back to the federal government. But more importantly, to repay bonds, it's like a home mortgage. You pay it off over 20 years. That's a typical length of time. Sometimes you can go longer, sometimes shorter. But the key is you pay it off over a length of time, and you have to have an ongoing source to pay those bonds back. And right now, we do not have that. We have for likely the next 2 years, and that's it. So we need to identify that ongoing source before we can think about issuing bonds. The other thing is we also have to go through a rating. The city has not been rated for bond sales in a number of years, so that rating that happened a long time ago is no longer valid. When rating agencies come in, they take a look at the economic factors in the area. They look at the community economic factors as well as King County. And they also look at our financial management and if we have the ability to repay bonds. And I would say at this point, until we have a new revenue source on board, we don't have the ability to issue bonds at this point. It's a great idea, but we have to have a number of things in place first.
So I know last year when we had the discussion around the fiscal sustainability plan, that really understanding this, because there are some big ticket items in here, right? And when you look out just even over the next 6 years, those are some big dollars. And when you know, and like you said in there, there's more to come. So I don't know if we need to provide direction and if there's support from the rest of council, but I would like to see us start to take some of those steps so that if and when we feel the need to do that, that is something that is not still always many, many years in the future. I do think for some of these big parks projects, even the additional fire station upgrades, there are a number of really big ticket items that potentially would be a good idea to bond, maybe not, but right now we just keep saying it will take too long, there are too many things in between, and we just keep paying for it out of the other things. So I would like to see kind of a plan for what we have to do to start to prepare for that and what kinds of projects might we want to look at doing that. I think we've got a number of studies that are coming up next year that may lead to more capital projects when we look at our bike and ped studies. We have a ton of sidewalk gaps that we haven't even started to look at how we would fund for, again, that pedestrian safety. So I do think, that would be something we should start to look at doing, because I know it's not something we can just snap our fingers and do. Is that something you need direction on, Scott, or is that something we can start to kind of put some of those wheels in motion? It doesn't mean we're going to, make it happen, but we can't make it happen without some of this groundwork.
Well, I was going to thank you for giving us a great bridge into the upcoming presentations that you're going to get Vicki's got stuff lined up to be talking about what does our future look like and how does it change if we make X decision or Y or Z. Part of that is in part to recognize that some of the projects that are in there that are part of the CIP right now, while they are transfers from the general fund, they are from fund balance, which is essentially a static account. when Vicki was referring to capacity, that is ongoing revenue capacity above our current operations budget. And so I think that's the difference, that you all can give direction to change what we spend the capital dollars on, and that's fine, but a lot of those are from fund balance of the individual funds, and the dollars coming from the general fund are from that static account and not from ongoing revenue.
Deputy Mayor Howe?
Thank you. I would be very interested in having an educational presentation on different options that have to do, like what the good, the bad, the ugly of a bond, for example, but also as we look at creating different financial districts as options, what do we need to have prepped and ready to be able to transact on something like that? Because I think we're looking at an array of options. And I think that we're confronting the reality that we have a finite amount of capital that will be used for existing projects going forward that are currently documented. And unless we make some very difficult decisions about robbing Peter to pay Paul, that's all we got is Peter and Paul. So that will bring forward, I think, the revenue discussion, I think, very quickly, which I am looking forward to. So to your point, we have to have that revenue source in order to do anything. Thank you.
Yeah, and I just want to add on to that is any new revenue source, whether it's a voter approved, like a park district or a transportation benefit district, or even implementing a utility tax, because I know that was talked about during the Fiscal Sustainability Committee work that was done last year. Those revenue sources do not materialize overnight, right? It takes time and effort to put those in place. If we were to start on a utility tax as an example now, if you said now go, we might be able to get it up and running by January 1st of 2026, just because of the amount of work that needs to go into it, right? We need to figure out what the program looks like. We have to write the legislation for it. We have to do all the education for why we need this. And then we have to do the outreach to all of the utility providers to let them know this is coming. And some of those utility providers we know, but some of them we don't. And telecom is a big area where we've got a lot of work ahead of us to pull something like that off. So the sooner the answer is yes, go, the sooner we can actually get started working on this.
Councilmember Lamb?
Yeah, I would like to see a conversation happening next week on revenue sources as well. I know the Fiscal Sustainability Commission, they did a lot of work. They were looking at, I think, like 16 or different options. They were given those, and I know that council has additional ideas for additional revenue sources. So I'd like to basically have a full discussion on other revenue options that could bring revenue before a utility tax. Thank you.
Councilmember Treen?
Thank you, Mayor. So I like what you were saying there, Vicki, about the sustainability. Financial sustainability is definitely one of the major priorities of the council, past and present, and hopefully for the future. That's why it's called sustainable. So I know that so we purchased through the city manager, by approval of the council, software or a modeling system to be able to work kind of this system out, or the revenues versus expense and that kind of stuff. So just making you aware of that, and that I would be interested in seeing how what does sustainability look like, and what does that mean, especially on the land use, how we using the land, and then, where's infrastructure, where's the housing, where's it does fit into all these other things that we have to make decisions about. And so it's kind of like, okay, so what's the number, or what is the best path forward for the city of Sammamish so that we're financially sustainable? And then how will that impact the land use patterns that would be going forward? I mean, we're kind of we're going to be set for the next 10 years once we pass the comp plan update. And so it's kind of, you're looking at, okay, now that you have that information as well, what does that look like financially? And what might we need to do over the next 10 years before we can really go back and change the comp plan, or what shouldn't we do too? It's kind of two sides of the coin, right? There's some things you should do, and there's some things that you definitely shouldn't do as well. So I'd be interested in seeing those, and so we can avoid some of the unintended consequences that might happen from making a wrong decision. Thank you.
Councilmember O'Farrell?
I just wanted to add my 2 cents and just say that I kind of support what Councilmember Lamb and Councilmember Stewart had said about looking at all the options for revenue streams, and I would look forward to seeing more information about that, what our options are going forward. So yeah, that sounds great. Thank you.
All right. I appreciate your 16-page memo. I think it was really helpful. I am no fan of the budget process. Everybody knows that. But this was really a good start, especially because, like you said, this is coming back like 9 more times. So I really appreciate how clearly you have explained and laid this out for us. So does anyone else have anything before we let Vicki go for tonight?
Good job.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah.
Can I just one follow-up before we part? I do want to say that the broader conversation about all the revenue options, and that's not going to be available next week. I want to be clear about that. We do need to focus on what's actually in the budget, and then the follow-up conversation, we can bring that back. But I just want to set expectation that next week will not be that spot. We'll talk about some of the look ahead, but I think I want to make sure that we can actually get into what's in the budget first, and then talk about how that impacts the future and have that broader conversation. And I do appreciate council's direction on that.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Audrey. Thanks, Vicki. Thank you, Anjali. We see you.
Thank you.
All right, Mark, emergency sheltering assessment results and recommendations.
I think I'm going to go ahead and kick it off while Brian is getting set. So good evening, Mayor, Deputy Mayor, and council members. Mark Barrett, Administrative Services Director. In May, we contracted with IEM to conduct an assessment of our emergency sheltering capabilities and to provide some recommendations and a pathway forward. The work was paid for through an Emergency Management Performance Grant, or EMPG, that also had a match with it. The match is earmarked in order for us to take the recommendations and operationalize the appropriate recommendations that came out of this work. IEM is here this evening to present their findings and their recommendations. And so now I'd like to turn it over to Brian with IEM to present the presentation.
Good evening, everyone. First, I just want to confirm, am I coming through on the mic?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. And everyone can see the PowerPoint that I have shared?
We see the presenter view, but I think it's going to be fine.
Okay, well, let me see if I can just briefly see if I can give you the better view for that. Just 1 second here.
That looks good. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. Yep. All right, great. So good evening, everyone. My name is Brian Payne. I am the senior planner for IEM that was overseeing the contract team for putting together this sheltering assessment roadmap. We are going to keep things at pretty much a 10,000-foot view, just really giving you the broad strokes of our findings. So we're going to start off with a brief introduction to introduce the project, some of the basic concepts, talk about what our process was for gathering information. Then we're going to get into the actual recommendations roadmap, and then we'll allow for a little bit of discussion time in case any of the council members or anyone has any questions, and then we should be able to wrap things up. So to start off, The project purpose was to review the city of Sammamish's capabilities for sheltering and any current threat analysis to assess and find out what your capabilities are for potential mass shelter operations, as well as heating and cooling centers that would be used during an emergency or during inclement weather. A couple of concepts to introduce as part of this. The first is emergency support function number 6. For emergency managers, the way we coordinate when there is an emergency is through emergency support functions. There are 15 of them, and mass care is under the umbrella of ESF 6. So that's mass care, emergency assistance, temporary housing, and human services. Now, that is a bigger umbrella that involves things like feeding, bulk distribution. Our focus for this project, however, was pretty exclusively on sheltering. So that's really going to be the focus of what we talk about tonight. And two things that we do want to differentiate is the difference between a comfort center and a shelter. A comfort center is something that's devoted mainly to daytime support services. So, just a safe, dry place for people to congregate, maybe charge their phones, make sure that everybody is safe and is in a place where they know where they are. These are generally open during daytime hours. It could be something that you have open for maybe just a few hours. It could be over the course of several days, but there's just not an overnight accommodation function to that. Shelters, however, are full-blown overnight accommodations with essential services for affected individuals, and they can last anywhere from days to weeks. For really big disasters, there have been shelters that have been open for a number of months, but it is still just meant to be a temporary venue while more long-term recovery is handled. So to talk a little bit about our information analysis process, how we got to, kind of showing our work for how we got to the recommendations we're making. We reviewed the current Sammamish disaster plans. So that includes the city of Sammamish has a comprehensive emergency management plan that we reviewed. King County also has a comprehensive plan with a specific ESF 6 annex. And then King County also has a hazard mitigation plan with some information specific to Sammamish that provided us with some of the table setting for kind of what the general threats and hazards were for the city of Sammamish. We were also able to use some of the GIS data that you have on the City of Sammamish website to create some updated hazard maps that we included in our information analysis report. We also did some stakeholder interviews. We talked to King County Emergency Management. We talked to Eastside Fire and Rescue. We talked to the American Red Cross, and we got a sense for what their resources are, what they're bringing to the table, and also had some internal discussions with your administrative services department to find out what you had internally, just to get a good sense for what capabilities you currently have. And so we compiled all that information into an analysis brief that provides insight into your current threats, what your current capabilities are, and where there's gaps. And we did provide copies of that to your administrative services department. So if there needs to be more detailed review on that, they have that information. Our focus today, however, is going to be specifically on the recommendations that we're making. And the approach we took to how we were going to model these recommendations, we initially had this actual roadmap laid out, like a recommendations roadmap, but then it occurred to us, like I live in Seattle, I live in the Pacific Northwest, we love camping, so we figured we would model it after campsites. And so we have kind of 3 tiers of campsites. The first campsite is devoted to confirming your sheltering capabilities and protocols. It is a short-term milestone, something we're picturing at 3 to 12 months. And it's kind of something we're picturing like a basic, the metaphor here would be like a basic tent setup. Campsite 2 gets into increasing your sheltering capabilities through partnerships and through internal building. That is more of a midterm plan. It's 1 to 5 years. And you can kind of look at that as something like an A-frame cabin. And then campsite 3 is really an aspirational campsite. This is like the big hunting lodge that has all the bells and whistles. It's a 5+ year kind of a goal if you're doing it at all. And that's really achieving self-sustaining sheltering within the city of Sammamish. And just to make things clear, we approached this from the point of view of emergency managers, where we looked at these are all the things that could possibly happen, for example, up to and including a catastrophic event like an earthquake and tsunami caused by the Cascadia subduction zone. And the campsite 3 model that we have is really looking at, the sky is falling kind of an operation where you're not going to get any outside help. But we also recognize that the reality of the situation is that based off of your resources and personnel that you have available, campsite 3 is probably not going to be all that feasible, at least unless you find like other sources of revenue or you get like an influx of people and personnel. So what we're going to be recommending is that you focus more on landing somewhere between campsite 1 and campsite 2, where if you get like a lot of your sheltering capabilities and protocols confirmed with your partners and maybe build a little bit through contracts, you're going to be way ahead of the curve on especially compared to other jurisdictions in this area. And then you can just kind of keep like an aspirational telescope looking at campsite 3, like maybe one day that is something you can dive into. But right now, campsite 1 and 2, like somewhere in between there, you're going to be able to handle the majority of sheltering operations that would come up. So to give you an idea on what would go into each of these campsites, campsite 1, like I said, we estimate this to be about a 3 to 12 month project. And it involves establishing a sheltering task force. So that's basically identifying who your key shelter stakeholders are going to be, both within Sammamish and externally. Bringing them in to start to develop what the roles and responsibilities of this task force would be. So, providing coordination, providing different like subject matter expertise, things like that, and then developing, maintaining, and implementing more formal protocols about how you're going to coordinate during a disaster, which would then lead directly into updating your comprehensive emergency management plan, and specifically your ESF6 annex. So what we want to do there, what we're recommending is that you validate who the lead agency and coordinator is going to be during a sheltering operation, update the total list of comprehensive stakeholders based off of discussions that you have. You do have a list of assumptions and hazards currently in the plan. We are recommending that you review those with your stakeholders to find out if they are accurate or if they need to be updated. And then just overall revising your concept of operations within the ESF6 annex to serve as a functional plan for sheltering. Right now, it's very abstract and just kind of lists general kind of possible functions that different departments could have. We would recommend turning that into more of a strategic and tactical plan that really gets into the weeds on how people are going to coordinate and how people are going to get the help in place that people are going to need when sheltering. And then last but not least, we are recommending developing the capacity for some kind of very transitional comfort center. And what we're talking about here is the American Red Cross has committed in our discussions with them, their commitment is that if they are not being pulled to any other kinds of disasters, they can provide 2 100-person shelters within 1 day of being requested. And so the only thing that we see as a gap that needs to be filled there is, within the same day, there could still be a number of hours where especially if it's an inclement weather incident, people are maybe stuck in the snow or the rain, they need someplace safe and dry to go. So we are recommending Sammamish be able to have the capacity to just have some kind of interim comfort center, a place where people can congregate, a place where people can be safe, can, if people, need to know where they're going so they can reunify because maybe they got separated. This is going to be a minimal lift overall. You need a location, you need a few people to open the doors and get resources, and maybe have some like bottles of water and some general snacks so that people, have something until the Red Cross gets there. And exactly what that'll look like, I think, will depend on having a conversation with the Red Cross to get a sense for realistically how quickly they can get out there. And one of the things you might consider is kind of having a dual purpose place where it starts off as a comfort center. And then when the Red Cross gets there, have it be a place where they can just transition that directly into a shelter. So that is what we're looking at for Campsite 1. So again, that's just kind of confirming all of your resources and setting up standard protocols for how you're going to initiate those resources. Next, we are recommending something that gets into increasing your shelter capabilities. And so the key thing there is that you can develop, build, and maintain partnerships. And one of the ways to do that is to establish contracts for services to be activated in the event of disaster. There are standby shelter contracts that you can set up with companies that once activated, they can supply the people and the resources needed to stand up a shelter as long as they have a location. So, if there are people, if you have anxiety about, while we're building up these resources, what do we do if something happens? That's one way that you can kind of get some resources in place. And then in the interim, you can continue to reach out to neighboring jurisdictions, start setting up mutual aid agreements with them to kind of fill in gaps where one another might have resources, but the other doesn't. And then you can start to build internally. And you can start doing that initially by establishing a community education program. I loved the proclamation earlier, talking about Preparedness Month and recommending people get out and get their disaster kits, things like that. That is a great kind of start in that direction. And there are established disaster readiness campaigns that you can leverage to start reaching out to your community. The Red Cross, FEMA, King County all have readiness materials for disasters that you can pull from. And then you can also start to incorporate local information about what people need to expect when they evacuate, if they need to shelter in place, like in their homes, or if they need to shelter at a facility in Sammamish. Then you can start to use those presentations as an opportunity for outreach to recruit community members who might be interested in volunteering. And if you're doing that, then you obviously need to start establishing an infrastructure for interested volunteers. The number one thing we can say for that is to collaborate with the American Red Cross. As Sammamish, you don't want to be initiating or establishing your own infrastructure for volunteers when the American Red Cross already has stuff in place to vet volunteers, onboard them, train them. They're going to be a great resource if you want to start leveraging volunteers for local responses. You also do have a local community emergency response team that does disaster like readiness and response work. So Sammamish does have an opportunity there as well to bolster that relationship and see where you can increase capacity there. And then last, for Campsite 2, we're recommending developing a training and exercise schedule, making sure that the people you do have devoted to doing sheltering have the appropriate training. Again, that's another link that you can do with the American Red Cross. And then we also recommend holding a tabletop exercise, which is just a discussion-based exercise where you get sheltering stakeholders around a table to either go through the sheltering plan that you have, or develop a scenario that would utilize the sheltering plan and just discuss what each agency and entity would be responsible for, to identify areas where the plan needs to be updated, or to identify where capacity needs to be bolstered in order to meet what you're expected to do in the plan. And then last but not least is achieving that self-sustaining kind of sheltering capability. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because honestly, it's a lot of just doing more of what you would already be doing. And again, this is something that would be way down the line if you were even considering doing something like this for whatever resources you have within Sammamish. So the number one objective would be developing a self-sustaining shelter team. So you would need to develop a staffing matrix. That would be another thing to reach out to the Red Cross for, to get subject matter expertise on that. You would want to establish self-contained shelter resources. I do want to point out here that Sammamish does have a pretty solid starting point for shelter material inventory. You have a a shipping container that's filled with at least enough cots and blankets for between 150 and 200 people. And when we did check it out, I went down with Mark and Lacey, and we were able to see that it's in good shape. So at this point, it would just be kind of adding to those materials to make sure you had everything you needed to run a shelter. And then last but not least, holding a more operational exercise, something where instead of just sitting around a table, you're actually going to the site of the shelter that you've designated and actually seeing, what steps it would take to get the people and the resources at the location where you're going to need it. And then you could take that exercise and find out where do you still have gaps in your capacity to figure out what you need to do to keep bolstering your sheltering capabilities. So I did want to open things up to see if anybody does have any questions or input on the recommendations we've laid out.
Deputy Mayor Howe.
Thank you, and thank you for the presentation. I'd love to get some more detail around how this was kind of put together, because like, who did you guys work with at King County Emergency Management? Was it our section leader for the region?
Mark, I believe his name was Nathan.
Nathan? Okay, because he originally was actually from the Red Cross, or I had worked with the Red Cross before he went to King County. So my first question does have to do with Red Cross. So Red Cross saying that they would be here in a day, I find strains credulity, because I could envision if it was a significant event, we're not the only ones affected, for example, and that is good. And those partnerships, it'd be every man for himself or every jurisdiction for himself. So I see the partnerships collapsing. I don't see Red Cross getting here in 24 hours. I'm wondering if the resiliency plan should be, just assume you're not going to have help, but assume you've got to have things together for yourself, because you're not going to get the assistance you might need. So I think I'm looking at this as kind of a cascading thing where for a comfort station, sure. But if it were a truly dramatic event, it would impact a larger region, a larger area, and I wouldn't see assistance coming in anytime soon. Do you have a response to that?
I think the response initially is going to be by establishing that task force, that sheltering task force, where you're getting various agencies and partners together, that's where you can get a better sense for what the reality of the expectations can be. And by starting those conversations when the sky isn't falling, you can have a better sense for what to expect when the sky is falling, about what the reality is of what people can provide. And yeah, when we talked to the Red Cross, we talked to Jamie Hill, who I believe is a disaster program manager that covers this area. And she was very clear to say that, those two shelters are, as long as, we're not getting pulled in other directions where there is a big disaster. And so, and there are going to be, there are plenty of instances where something could happen in Sammamish that just happens in Sammamish. There could be, inclement weather that, maybe knocks out a power line that, again, is just, in your city, or there could be a incident specific to Sammamish where, you're not going to have to worry about adjudicating or competing for resources. The question of what to do when everybody is kind of rushing for the same resources, that is, for me, honestly, the $64,000 question. That is the kind of thing that people run into every time there is a really big disaster. And that is, why we bring up that idea of the aspiration toward becoming self-sustaining within Sammamish, but again, the reality of what that would take and the resources that would require. The best starting point is with that first campsite, to know exactly who your partners are and get a sense for, where might there be competition for resources, where can we minimize that competition for resources? Because if you can, document your planning so who's going to be asking for what and when they're going to be asking for it, it makes it less of a surprise when it happens during a disaster.
Okay, I'm confused about the staffing matrix in that I don't understand what staff are you referring to, in that we don't have access to city staff, so I'm not sure who you meant.
That would be like, honestly, theoretical shelter staffing. So a staffing matrix would be a matrix that would show you, based off of, let's say you wanted to run a shelter capable of holding 100 people and you wanted to be able to run it for 5 days. A staffing matrix would show you how many staff you would want to have lined up to be able to fill that.
Okay. So
that isn't necessarily getting into who you have to fill it. It's basically establishing what the need is. And then, the hard work would be figuring out how do you build the people who can actually fill that?
Yeah, because we're actually kind of starting from below zero on this to a certain extent.
Oh, absolutely.
There used to be a series of CERT classes for different residents that was fairly active, but we haven't had that to my knowledge here for quite some time. So I couldn't tell you who was CERT certified, who's had any FEMA training whatsoever. So we're starting from behind the curve, I believe. Okay, we have one, apparently, the mayor, thank God. But I think you see my point, is that I'm also kind of looking for the practical building blocks of the recruitment process, how long it takes, how many, you've answered the question, having a matrix would tell me how many people I need and by when, and can they even get to the conversation that we establish. Now, when you talked about partnerships, again, I'm a little confused. You didn't actually specify what kinds of partnerships those could be. The obvious one would be schools. How hard is it to work out something with the school district?
So when I'm talking partnerships, I mean the partnering with schools in terms of like using their locations.
Correct.
That would be a discussion that they might be people that you consider bringing into your task force. And I do know that the Red Cross, at least on paper, already has some potential shelter locations designated with shelter surveys. But again, that would be something that I think that is, potentially just on paper right now. So having those conversations and getting a more realistic sense on where you're starting is probably a great place to start. But yeah, in terms of partnerships, talking to the schools, finding out what their viability is to serve as a shelter location would be a great place to start. Talking to your neighboring, townships and jurisdictions is another great place to start. And just kind of starting close to you geographically to get a sense for what other people are doing, because it could be a kind of a dual purpose thing where you're seeing what the resources are, but you're also, maybe looking into their subject matter expertise as well to kind of find out what their boots on the ground picture actually looks like, and if they've been able to crack any of these questions on a local level for themselves.
From what I understand, very few jurisdictions actually have a full-time emergency manager on staff. They're more reliant on part-time consultants periodically, or someone that job shares has that as a responsibility among many others. And so there's deficiencies really all throughout, sprinkled throughout the entire our area. Schools right now won't let nonprofits use their facilities for liability reasons or whatever, whatever barriers they see. So I do see some difficult hurdles that have to be overcome in order to establish some of these partnerships because of the deficits here. Did you look at anything? Did you look at any models, for example, of current encampments and shelters that could be transferable in a short time notice? By that I mean, there's a church in Redmond that does that allows cars to park overnight for extended periods of time. Is there anything like that that's ever been contemplated, like a parking lot even, that could be used for people who could take their cars and park and then come in to get warm, but have a place to sleep if we don't have a place for them all to sleep separately, the 6 feet required distance apart?
Yeah, I mean, that's really what we're talking about when we talk about a comfort center, is that daytime model of, you're not looking for anybody to have a place to have, a cot or a place to lay their head to sleep at night. But that comfort center model is really finding that location for, getting into a safe place and having a place to congregate during the day while figuring out kind of what they're going to do overnight.
And the other piece, of course, is we don't understand just, I understand your recommendation, try to do this in 12 months, but we don't have a budget or staff assigned to something like this. But maybe Mark could speak to that part of it.
I can recall that we used an EMPG, which is the Emergency Management Performance Grant, to fund this work, and it has a 100% match associated with it. And so we have those funds set aside to sort of do the part 2, which starts now, which is to get those partners together, to get with the ACDCs, the IEMs of the world, to put together some of those on-call contracts, to try to have some things in place in a more immediate way to show some progress as we move through. And then at the end, when we put together kind of the package for Sammamish, then we can begin to do the paperwork transition as well. So we do have some funding set aside for this, anticipating that we would need some resources to operationalize it. And that funding is likely to be used for some of the same expertise to help walk us through facilitating those partnership meetings, in making sure that as we update our plans, that we cover the important things, making sure we have 3, 4, or 5 on-call contracts, because as Brian and I think others have pointed out, you never know what else is going on in the world, and so you want some redundancy in people that have some resources that could come in to help us if we unfortunately needed to have it done. And then continuing to work with our partners as we work with King County and as we interact with Issaquah and the others, to try to all come together to sort of help each other out, because we all have similar shortcomings and we all have similar needs.
I think what I'm looking for is something that is more operational in terms of, and prescriptive. I am looking for something prescriptive, that, we're going to talk to these agencies, we're going to have that done by X time, and it's this is our expectation and the service delivery that we're hoping to get, and here's what we're on the hook for delivering other people. Because if we're a partner, then we're a partner to them. So how do we help Issaquah? Because they don't have an emergency manager either. So how do we help them?
And some of that is going to come with this part 2. We first had them take a look at everything to see what they thought for our jurisdiction could or couldn't be feasible, given everything from our collective bargaining agreements to the number of our staff to all of the things that you heard Brian go through. And now we're going to begin to do that, where we put together the work plan to spend the other funds in order to put together just what you're looking for.
Thank you.
Councilmember O'Farrell.
Thank you. Mark, so it seems from this report that this is type of like a situational analysis, that this is kind of where we are right now, and then this is what we're potentially going to need. And when we talked about those comfort centres and the shelters, I'm going to assume that some of the organisations, because we have a lot of organisations in Sammamish who own large facilities of their own, like schools, like was mentioned earlier, like our faith-based organisations who have large facilities themselves, large parking lots. And so do we intend to contact those organisations and bring them in so that they would be resources we can access in certain situations where we need to set up a comfort centre or a shelter on a temporary basis?
Yeah, part of the work going forward is identifying those and what they bring to the table, right? For instance, in shelters, you need greater resources than you would if it was just a comfort center. And so schools are always attractive because they have lunchrooms and they have restrooms and they have locker rooms and things of that sort. Some of those things that you need to take into account. And so part of that work and part of when Brian talks about getting together with partners, it's not just partners that you can rely on for some other things, but it is those brainstorming sessions where we see what other resources out there and what can they contribute, so that then we can put together a plan that includes all of those different types of things, because you also don't know in an emergency what might actually be available and usable.
Right, and I think with working with some of our organizations, local, particularly faith-based, when this is exactly something that I'm assuming is part of their mission, and to be part of a coordinated effort to help our community during a natural disaster of some kind, I would imagine that maybe they have a plan of their own, and it would be I think it would be very useful to plug into that and give them an opportunity to plug into ours, so that we're all coordinated when and if we ever need it.
And as an example of that, on Saturday the 14th from noon to 3, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is having a emergency preparedness fair in which King County, Sammamish Plateau and Water, City of Sammamish, Lacey is going to be there. They're doing a blood drive, and it's an element where they're getting some people together to talk about this a little bit. And I think that goes a little bit to what you're suggesting.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense that I think a lot of our faith-based organizations, it's their mission to be there for the community. So it would be an opportunity to bring everybody together in that way. So yeah, that's great. Thank you for that.
Right, does anyone else have any other questions or comments? All right, Mark, do you know when you're coming back to us with that second step or steps?
Yeah, we're in the process now of trying to put together a bit of the scope of work. So let me get with the schedule. It will be sometime in the fall.
All right, thank you so much.
You bet.
Okay, next up we have public comment. Did anyone sign up for online?
Yes, we had one pre-registered public commenter. Per the new reasonable accommodations, those who have pre-registered by 5 o'clock today, please raise your hand if you wish to give testimony. If you wish to, I will unmute the pre-registered callers in the order they've raised their hand. Okay, it looks like we do not have a public comment this evening.
Great, thank you so much, Amber.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, we're just getting back to it. People are tired. It's okay. Scott, do you have anything to report?
Thank you, Mayor. Just very briefly, I want to remind again that Welcoming Week is this next week at the Farmers, or is, what day is today? Oh my goodness, it's next week at the Farmers Market. And to please come out and join us as part of that. It should, hopefully the weather will be good and it should be a really nice event. So I want to continue to encourage our community to come out and join us to remind that we are a welcoming community to all. And for the moment, that's all I got.
Does anyone on council have anything to report or add? Councilmember Lamb?
I have a Public Issues Committee meeting on Wednesday. I sent out the agenda. I just wanted to call out one of the agenda topics is a guide that King County is putting out on tree regulations on private property. Just for a little bit of background, that the majority of what the trees in King County are on private property, which means it's locally regulated. So having regulations that are effective because they do vary across municipalities. So this guide is like a toolkit. They've looked at codes from across different municipalities and also across the country to find out which were the most effective regulations. So I passed it on to staff, and they'll be, using it as a reference as we look at our tree management in the next couple of years.
Great, thank you so much. Anyone else? Yeah, Councilmember Stewart?
Yeah, I have another FAC meeting tomorrow, and then we have our E4 board meeting on Thursday, so we continue to drill down into the Eastside Fire and Rescue budget conversations. I forwarded the agenda to everyone. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks.
All right, anyone else? Awesome. Good night, everybody. Thank you.